Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Friday, 16 February 2024. It is the 148th anniversary of the birth of George Macaulay Trevelyan, who was born in Stratford-upon-Avon on this date in 1876. Trevelyan wrote during the heyday of the empire, but he lived long enough to see the end of the empire. And he started out as an academic who eventually left academia to become a full-time writer of histories, very successfully. He was one of the most widely read historians of his time, even though his reputation rapidly collapsed after he died. So what's the difference between a popular historian read by millions and an academic historian? Honestly, I don't know. I can give examples, but they don't really give a clear rule. So this strikes me as a academic history. Ruling Class, Regime, and Reformation at Strasbourg, 1520 to 1555 by Thomas A. Brady. And this also seems like a scholarly history. Land, liberties, and lordship in a late medieval countryside, agrarian structures and change in the Duchy of Wrocław by Richard C. Hoffman. In contrast, this seems to me like a popular history, Empire of the Summer Moon. Quanah Parker and the Rise and Fall of the Comanches, the most powerful Indian tribe in America by S.C. Gwynn. And another popular history, in my judgment, would be Peter Stark's Astoria, John Jacob Astor and Thomas Jefferson's Lost Pacific Empire, a story of wealth, ambition, and survival. So you could say that it was the author. You could say it was the publisher. This is published by Brill. It's a noted academic publisher. You could say it was the intended audience, or you could say not merely the intended audience, but it's the actual audience. You might a historian might write a book for a restricted audience, and it ends up becoming a bestseller, and that has happened with a few books. When in I think it was in the 80s when the Closing of the American Mind came out, that was intended only to be for a few academics, and it ended up being a sensation that was talked about quite a bit at the time. Or we could say it's the method by which history is treated. The popular accounts are going to be driven by narrative, and the scholarly accounts less so. But even there, that's not even a good rule, because they can, both scholarly and popular histories can be, strong or weak on narrative. So I don't know exactly what marks the difference between a scholarly history and a popular history. And I don't know if George Trevelyan should be called a scholarly historian, because his books were deeply researched and he was an academic, or started out as an academic, or whether we should call him a popular historian because he was among the most widely read historians of his time. Maybe it doesn't matter. Trevelyan was particularly well known for his work on Italian history, and more especially for Italian reunification under Garibaldi. Garibaldi was a superstar of the age. When he came to London in 1860-something, it was a mob scene, basically. Hundreds of thousands of people came to see him. So there was a popular appetite for books on Garibaldi, and Trevelyan helped to sate that appetite. He referenced his writings on Garibaldi in a 1947 essay titled Bias in History, which I think is a very interesting essay that's well worth reading. So I quote, "I once wrote 3 volumes on Garibaldi. They are reeking with bias. Without bias, I should never have written them at all. for I was moved to write them by poetical sympathy with the passions of the Italian patriots of that period, which I retrospectively share. Such merit as the work has largely derives from that, and some of its demerits also derive from the same cause. Even I now can see that I was not quite fair to the French or to the Papalists or to the Italian conservative points of view in 1849. If I had to write the first volume of that trilogy again, I should alter this somewhat, though not enough to satisfy everyone. But in fact, I could not possibly write the book again. What is good in it derived from the passions and powers of my youth, now irrecoverable, unquote. This is what we would call today the problem of objectivity in history, or at least a part of the problem of objectivity, which is one of the great problems in philosophy of history, mostly because the vast majority of history throughout history has catastrophically been failed to be objective in virtually any sense at all. Both Walsh and Dre, in their introductory works on philosophy of history, devote a chapter to objectivity. It's difficult to say exactly in what historical objectivity consists or what it ought to consist. And since objectivity is honored more in the breach than the observance, we could say, what is a failure of objectivity? Here we seem to have some ready answers. It's implied that maybe subjectivity is the opposite of objectivity, perhaps the subjective bias of the writer of history. Or we could say relativism is the object of objectivity, historical relativism. We could even say nihilism or historical skepticism are the antithesis of historical objectivity. One way to define failure of objectivity is the presence of bias, and this is what Trevelyan did in his essay that I just quoted from. And one form of bias is the making of moral judgments upon history and historical events and historical persons. Arguably, this is the form of bias that has resulted in the greatest havoc in the writing of history. Misplaced moral rectitude has led us down more than one primrose path. Trevelyan begins his discussion on bias in history in an eminently rational way. Quote, I am going to define a bias in history for the purposes of my argument today as a thing not necessarily good or necessarily bad. I define it as any personal interpretation of historical events which is not acceptable to the whole human race. In this sense of the word, it is biased to think that the Allies in the late war were more in the right than the Germans and Japanese. We have no doubt about it, but the opinion is not universal. So by my definition, it is bias, although it is true. In this sense, I do not think bias can or ought to be avoided by any historian, unquote. Trevelyan also asks some excellent questions. Quote, I will not ask the question, is bias in history permissible? I will ask the more fruitful questions, what sort of bias is permissible and what are its limits, unquote. So in the essay, Trevelyan considers a number of cases. He discusses, for example, the French Revolution and Carlyle's take on the French Revolution and other examples as well, each taken in its proper context, as you would expect from an historian. He recognizes the inevitability of bias while acknowledging the harm that bias can do. Quote, since history is our interpretation of human affairs in the past, it should not exist without, it could not exist without bias, but with a wrong bias, it can be gravely distorted. God give us each a true bias, unquote. In this essay, Trevelyan carves out a particular exception for moral judgments. Quote, I agree with Lord Acton that it is the duty of the historian to display a bias for the moral law impartially applied, unquote. Lord Acton had a number of statements on observing the moral law in history, and he had a particularly long-running quarrel with another historian by the name of Crichton about this. Acton wrote in one of his essays on history, quote, "The weight of opinion is against me when I exhort you never to debase the moral currency or to lower the standard of rectitude, but to try others by the final maxim that governs your own lives, and to suffer no man and no cause to escape the undying penalty which history has the power to inflict on wrong," unquote. I don't know if Acton realized this or not, but he is placing the historian in the position of a not just a judge, but the purgatory that historical figures must pass through in order to eventually redeem themselves, if they do ever, or the hell to which historical figures go if they violate what Acton saw as the moral law. You could argue that this exception for moral bias invalidates the entire idea of a history free of bias. And Trevelyan acknowledges that an ideal history would be free of bias, even if he acknowledges the inevitability of it. But he can't describe what an ideal history would look like. But he ends his essay with what I find a particularly interesting observation. Quote, "Each of us, when he forms any humblest judgment of an historical matter, does so not as a scientist, not as an artist, but as a philosopher, a wise man. An historian may be a great scientific researcher or a fine artist in historical narrative, and yet lack the true judgment of values, have the wrong sort of bias, be in fact no philosopher. You may complain that such judgments are all matters of opinion. So they are. All history is a matter of opinion based on facts, of opinion guided and limited by facts that have been scientifically discovered. But the opinion or bias cannot itself be scientific. It must be philosophic," unquote. Trevelyan's conclusion then is that what history needs is philosophical bias, which is an interesting claim to make. And this can be found in a slightly different form in Walsh's The Philosophy of History and Introduction, Chapter 5, Can History Be Objective? Walsh writes, quote, "For objective understanding of the kind contemplated, the historian needs not merely standard knowledge of how people do behave in a variety of situations, but further, a standard conception of how they ought to behave. He needs to get straight, not merely his factual knowledge, but also his moral and metaphysical ideas. There are many philosophers today who would say that a program for providing a standard set of moral and metaphysical ideas is not merely one of extreme difficulties, it is simply impossible of attainment," unquote. Since Trevelyan had earlier in the essay suggested that, quote, "There are some great historical subjects on which the best we can look for is a balance of divergent opinions," unquote. Should we also seek a balance of divergent morals and divergent metaphysics? Trevelyan argued moral disapproval, quote, "Moral disapproval should, I think, be part of the historian's bias. Indeed, it is part of his duty, but its expression requires literary art to do it well," unquote. Would the ideal history be free of all bias except the bias that is the historian's duty? Neither the duty of moral bias nor the ideal history that incorporates obligatory moral bias, if that's what it is, are inconsistent with a variety of moral viewpoints. We could have a number of historians coming to a subject matter, and in fact, we do have historians of widely different moral viewpoints writing books of widely different moral judgments upon historical figures and historical events. However, Trevelyan also says in the essay, quote, "If the moral standards of an age are wrong in theory as well as in practice, it is the business of the historian to point it out," unquote. This implies a trans-historical moral standard by which the present can judge the past and by which we should expect to be judged by the future in like fashion. I think it's important to note here that we can't even formulate what an ideal history would look like. In the opening quote I made from Trevelyan, he says he wouldn't even have written his volumes on Garibaldi if he hadn't have had that bias, if he hadn't have had that interest. So we write our histories on the basis of human interests, and one historian is drawn to one topic, one historian to another. That is bias, as Trevelyan says in his essay. We can't get rid of that, so it's inevitable, as Trevelyan said. Also, we probably shouldn't get rid of that. People should study the areas of history in which they're most interested, or otherwise history would be even more deadly dull than some of it is. You could formulate a thought experiment in which a historian would be assigned to write the history of a period in which he had no interest whatsoever, and everybody would write everybody else's history and be uninterested in it. And I think the result of that would not be good. But it's a fun thought experiment worth thinking about. I agree with Trevelyan that bias is inevitable. And I agree that the historian should aspire to the kind of philosophical bias that Trevelyan described. But I also agree with Walsh that that seems nearly unattainable, that the general philosophical program of a moral and metaphysical background for history, that is perhaps as unattainable as ideal history without bias is unattainable. And we are a very long way from formulating either an ideal history or an ideal philosophical program for the education of the historian. So happy birthday, George Trevelyan, and thanks for listening.